The world held its breath in the blue hour before dawn. A vast expanse of ice stretched endlessly, a kingdom of white and silver beneath a sky streaked with the first pale fingers of light. Glaciers, like frozen rivers, carved their slow, inexorable paths through the land, grinding stone to dust beneath their weight. The air was sharp, brittle with cold, each inhalation a reminder of the dominion winter held over this age. In the distance, the jagged peaks of mountains stood sentinel, their summits lost in swirling mist. The wind whispered through the ice, a sound like glass chimes, carrying with it the scent of snow and the faint metallic tang of distant storms. The sun, when it finally breached the horizon, did so hesitantly, a molten sliver of gold bleeding into the indigo sky. Its light spilled across the ice, setting the world ablaze with reflections, as if the earth itself had been dipped in fire. Life stirred in the silence. A lone Arctic fox, its fur thick and white as the snow it trod upon, picked its way across the tundra, nose twitching for the scent of lemmings hidden beneath the frost. High above, a snowy owl glided soundlessly, wings spread wide, its yellow eyes scanning the ground for movement. The ice was not barren, not truly. It was a world of hidden rhythms, of creatures adapted to the bite of winter, to the long nights and fleeting days. Near a frozen lake, a herd of woolly mammoths moved in a slow procession, their shaggy coats dusted with frost, their breath pluming in the air like smoke. The matriarch led them, her tusks curving like ancient scimitars, her ears flicking at the distant rumble of shifting ice. The calves stayed close, pressed against their mother's sides, learning the paths their ancestors had walked for millennia, and beneath it all, beneath the ice and the snow, the earth slept but not peacefully. Deep in the permafrost, seeds lay dormant, waiting for a thaw that would not come for centuries. In the crevasses of glaciers, air bubbles trapped from millennia held the secrets of ancient skies. The world was poised on the edge of change, though none who walked it now could sense it. For now there was only the dawn, the cold and the quiet. The Ice Age had claimed the earth, and in its frozen embrace, life endured. Beneath the stillness of the Ice Age world, a deeper rhythm pulsed, one measured not in seasons, but in millennia. The great glaciers that sprawled across the continents, the bitter winds that scoured the tundra, even the slow migrations of mammoths and caribou, all were shaped by forces far beyond the reach of human eyes. The earth, it seemed, had a breath of its own. It was a Serbian scientist, Milutin Milankovic, who first traced the contours of this celestial dance in the early 20th century. A mathematician with the patience of a monk, he spent decades hunched over calculations, deciphering the subtle wobbles and tilts of the planet's path around the sun. His work revealed a truth as elegant as it was profound. Ice ages were not random cataclysms, but the inevitable result of Earth's slow, rhythmic sway through space. The first of these cycles, eccentricity, measured the shape of Earth's orbit itself. Over 100,000 years, the planet's path around the sun shifted from nearly circular to a gentle ellipse and back again. When the orbit stretched at its most oblong, Earth spent more time in the frigid depths of space, far from the sun's warmth. Winters grew longer, harsher, snow accumulated faster than it could melt. But eccentricity alone was not enough to plunge the world into ice. It needed partners. Axial tilt, the second cycle, dictated the angle at which Earth leaned toward the sun. Every 41,000 years, this tilt oscillated between 22.1 and 24.5 degrees. A steeper tilt meant more extreme seasons, blistering summers, but also winters where the cold bit deeper and lingered longer. Over time, those winters stacked like layers of frost, compacting into sheets of ice that refused to retreat. And then there was precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, like a spinning top winding down. Over 26,000 years, this wobble altered which hemisphere faced the sun during its closest approach. A shift of a few degrees might seem insignificant, but in the delicate balance of climate, It meant the difference between a glacier's advance and its retreat. Together, these cycles wove a tapestry of cold and warmth, expansion and contraction. They were the unseen hands that sculpted the Ice Age, the quiet architects of a frozen world. Yet for all their power, the Milankovitch cycles moved with a slowness that defied human perception. A single lifetime might pass without noticing the shift, but the ice remembered. It grew, inch by inch, century by century, until one day the land itself was buried beneath its weight. And so the earth breathed in, and the ice spread its fingers. It breathed out, and the glaciers retreated. The dance continued, as it had for millions of years, and as it would for millions more. The interplay of Earth's celestial rhythms was a symphony of ice and warmth, each note resonating across millennia. Eccentricity, axial tilt, and precession did not act alone. Their combined whispers wove the fabric of the Ice Age, shaping the fates of continents and the creatures that roamed them. When the planet's orbit stretched into its most elliptical phase, the sun's grip weakened. Earth lingered in the cold embrace of deep space, and winter's bite sharpened. Snowfall, once fleeting, began to outpace summer's thaw. Layer upon layer compressed into ice, its weight pressing down until glaciers stirred like waking giants. But eccentricity's influence was slow, a drawn-out crescendo over 100,000 years, a timescale too vast for mortal minds to grasp. Axial tilt, meanwhile, dictated the ferocity of seasons. At its maximum incline, the poles leaned greedily toward the sun in summer, only to recoil into prolonged darkness in winter. The high latitudes bore the brunt of this tilt. Summer sun scorched the tundra, but winter's absence of light was absolute. Ice sheets, nourished by endless night, crept southward, their edges gnawing at forests and plains. Yet this too was a cycle, a pendulum swinging between extremes every 41,000 years. Precession, the slowest and subtlest of the three, decided which hemisphere would bear the harshest cold. As Earth's axis wobbled over 26,000 years, the timing of seasons shifted relative to the planet's position in its orbit. A hemisphere tilted away from the sun during its closest approach would suffer winters of unparalleled severity. Ice thrived in these conditions, its dominion expanding with each passing century. But the true power of these cycles lay in their convergence. When eccentricity elongated the orbit, axial tilt steepened, and precession aligned winters with Earth's farthest retreat from the sun, then the Ice Age reached its zenith. Glaciers swallowed valleys, sea levels plummeted as water locked into ice, and the world grew quieter, its breath slow and measured. Yet the dance was never static. A shift in just one cycle could unravel the cold. A milder tilt, a rounder orbit, or a different precessional phase, and the ice would falter. Meltwater pooled in newborn lakes, rivers carved fresh paths through the softening land, and life surged back into the thawing earth. The cycle would begin anew, an eternal rhythm written in the language of rock and sky. For the mammoths trudging across the tundra, for the humans huddled in caves, these changes were imperceptible. They lived and died within the span of a single note in the planet's symphony. But the ice remembered. It recorded every fluctuation, every tremor of climate, in its crystalline depths, a frozen archive of Earth's breath. And so the world turned, its fate entwined with the stars. The Ice Age was not an aberration, but a verse in an ancient song. The glaciers would come, and they would go. The earth would breathe in and out again and again, until the sun itself grew cold. The glacier did not hurry. It had no need to. Time was its ally, patience its tool. Inch by inch, year by year, it advanced, a river of ice, slow and inexorable, grinding the bones of the earth beneath its weight. Where mountains stood in its path, it wore them down like a sculptor chiseling stone. Granite, once unyielding, cracked under the relentless pressure. The glacier dragged its belly over the land, plucking boulders from their beds, polishing bedrock smooth as glass. Its frozen fingers gouged deep wounds into the earth, carving valleys where none had been before. In its wake, it left a new world. The fjords of Norway, those serpentine channels of blue water flanked by sheer cliffs, were its masterwork. The glacier had pressed down with such force that the land itself had bowed, and when the ice finally retreated, the sea rushed in to fill the scars. Now the cliffs rose like cathedral walls, their faces striated with the marks of ancient ice. Seabirds wheeled above the water, their cries echoing off stone that still remembered the cold. Further south, in the rolling hills of what would one day be called Wisconsin, the glacier had left a different signature. Here it had not carved deep, but spread wide, a vast sheet of ice that flattened everything beneath it. When it melted, it dumped its cargo of rubble in ragged lines, moraines, ridges of gravel and sand that traced the glacier's final stand. Between them, Kettle Lakes shimmered, their waters dark and still, born from chunks of ice left buried in the earth. The glacier was an artist, but its methods were brutal. It did not whisper. It roared. The sound of its movement was a low, ceaseless thunder, the creak and groan of ice splitting, of rock shattering. At its edges, meltwater surged in torrents, carving channels through the soft sediment, braiding rivers into existence. The water was gray with silt, thick with the pulverized remains of mountains, and yet, for all its violence, the glacier's work was achingly slow. A human lifetime was but a blink to it, a century, a mere sigh. It took millennia to shape a valley, to grind a peak into a gentle hill. The land it touched bore its mark forever, not just in the scars it left, but in the very soil. The glacier's grinding teeth had turned stone to dust, and from that dust, new life would one day rise. Now, in the heart of the Ice Age, the glacier was still at work. It stretched its frozen fingers southward, swallowing forests, burying rivers. Somewhere beneath its weight, the bones of mammoths lay entombed, their tusks gleaming in the dark. The air above it was still, cold enough to freeze breath into crystals. But the glacier did not care for bones or breath. It only moved, only carved, only shaped. It was the sculptor, and the earth was its marble. And when it was done, it would retreat, leaving behind a world remade. The ice was not silent. Deep within its crystalline layers, secrets murmured, tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped like forgotten words in glass. Each one was a time capsule, a fragment of the atmosphere from millennia past, preserved with near-perfect fidelity. To the scientists who drilled patiently through the frozen depths, these bubbles were more than curiosities. They were the Earth's memory, etched in gas and frost. The core sample lay on the lab table, a slender cylinder of ice gleaming under sterile lights. It had been extracted from the heart of Antarctica, where the ice stretched 2 miles thick, its oldest layers dating back nearly 1 million years. The researchers moved with reverent precision, their breath fogging in the chilled air as they worked. "Look at the bands," murmured Dr. Ilara Voss, her gloved finger tracing the striations in the ice. Like tree rings, each layer marked a year, some thicker, some impossibly thin, a record of snowfall and drought written in frozen water. But the true story lay deeper, imprisoned in microscopic pockets between the crystals. Her colleague, Dr. Henrik Johnson, adjusted the spectrometer, its needle-thin laser poised to pierce the ice. "This section should be from the last glacial maximum," he said. "Around 20,000 years ago. The world was colder then, drier. The machine hummed to life, vaporizing a sliver of ice. The released gases rushed into the analyzer, their molecular signatures flickering across the screen. Numbers scrolled: CO2, methane, nitrogen, a chemical fingerprint of the past." Ilara exhaled sharply. 300 parts per million CO2, she said. "Lower than I expected." Henrik nodded. "Now compare it to the Holocene samples." They moved to another segment of the core, this one younger, only 10,000 years old from the dawn of the current interglacial period. The spectrometer hissed again, and the numbers climbed. 250 to 280, Henrik read. Still low by modern standards, but a significant jump from the Ice Age. Alara leaned back, rubbing her temples. So the CO2 rises as the world warms and falls when it cools. It's a feedback loop, Henrik said. The Milankovitch cycles nudge the climate, but greenhouse gases amplify the signal. Less CO2 during glacials means colder temperatures, more during interglacials means warmer ones. A silence settled between them, heavy with implication. The ice was telling them a story of cause and consequence, of a planet whose climate was exquisitely sensitive to the faintest whispers of change. But there was more. Henrik pointed to a section near the bottom of the core, where the ice was oldest and most fragile. Look at the methane spikes, he said. See how they flicker, like a candle in the wind. Alara frowned. Methane was a potent greenhouse gas, and its sudden surges in the record were enigmatic. What caused that? Wetlands, maybe, Henrik mused, or permafrost thawing. Something released a burst of methane, then stopped. The climate flickered in response. The implications were unsettling. If tiny changes in atmospheric chemistry could sway the global climate, then the balance was fragile indeed. The Ice Age hadn't been a monolithic era of unbroken cold. It had been a stuttering thing, a dance of advances and retreats, all recorded in the ice. Outside the lab the wind howled, a reminder of the frozen expanse that still guarded its secrets. The core on the table was just one thread in a vast tapestry, one verse in an epic poem of frost and fire. And the ice was still speaking. If only they could decipher all its whispers. The ice did not lie. It told its stories in jagged peaks and sudden troughs, in layers where the chemistry shifted as abruptly as a slammed door. The deeper the scientists drilled, the stranger the tale became, not a steady march of cold, but a flickering, a stutter step of climate lurching between extremes. Look at this, Dr. Voss said, her voice tight. She pointed to a segment of the core where the ice turned cloudy, its crystalline clarity marred by fine dust. Greenland's records show the same thing, a sudden warming, fast, then a plunge back into cold. Henrik adjusted his glasses, squinting at the data. Dansgaard Oshka events, he murmured. 25 of them in the last glacial period alone. The numbers were staggering. Temperatures in the North Atlantic had spiked by as much as 10 degrees in decades, only to collapse just as swiftly. The ice recorded each swing like a seismograph, tracing an earthquake. But what triggered them? Alara asked. Henrik exhaled. The ocean, he said. It's always the ocean. The Atlantic's conveyor belt of currents had faltered, its rhythm disrupted by meltwater floods. Freshwater from collapsing ice sheets diluted the salty currents that drove the Gulf Stream, stalling the heat pump that warmed Europe. The climate, so delicately balanced, had tipped first one way, then the other, and the world had flickered like a candle in the wind. Elsewhere, in the dry valleys of Antarctica, another mystery lay trapped in the ice. Tiny bubbles from 14,000 years ago held a startling spike in CO2, one that preceded the thaw. It wasn't just the orbital cycles, said Dr. Lin Wei, her breath fogging in the cold lab. The greenhouse gases led the dance. The evidence was damning. As the Earth's orbit nudged the planet toward warmth, the permafrost had begun to exhale. CO2 seeped from thawing soils, methane bubbled up from wetlands. These gases thickened the atmospheric blanket, amplifying the initial warming, a feedback loop that accelerated the end of the Ice Age. But the ice had one last secret. At the very bottom of the core, in layers older than 800,000 years, the rhythm changed. Before that threshold, the glacial cycles had been shorter, 40,000 years, marching to the beat of axial tilt alone. Then abruptly, they stretched to 100,000 years, syncopated with eccentricity's slow drum. Why the switch? Alara wondered aloud. Henrik shrugged. Maybe the ice sheets grew too massive. Maybe they became their own beast, outliving the tilt cycles that birthed them. The ice offered no answers, only the ghosts of ancient skies, whispering of a time when the world's thermostat had been reset. And in those whispers, a warning. The climate is not a dial, but a pendulum. Push it too far, and it will swing back with a force beyond reckoning. The scientists packed the core away, its stories half told. Outside, the wind gnawed at the research station, a reminder that the ice still ruled here. For now, the ocean had a heartbeat. It pulsed in the dark, unseen but undeniable, a rhythm older than the continents. The great conveyor of currents, warm water flowing north, cold sinking south, had been the planet's circulatory system for millions of years. But now, in the deepening cold of the Ice Age, that pulse was slowing. Dr. Elias Carter stood on the deck of the research vessel Polaris, his hands braced against the rail as the ship cut through the iron-gray waters of the North Atlantic. The air was sharp with salt and the promise of snow. Behind him, a team of oceanographers lowered a CTD rosette into the depths, its array of sensors measuring temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, the vital signs of the sea. Another drop in salinity, called Mara, her voice nearly lost in the wind. She squinted at the data streaming onto her tablet. The surface layers getting fresher, more meltwater. Elias nodded grimly. He didn't need the numbers to know what was happening. The evidence was all around them, the icebergs drifting south like scattered ruins, the strange lethargy of the waves. The Gulf Stream, that mighty river within the ocean, was weakening, and the world was holding its breath. The thermohaline circulation was a delicate beast. It ran on salt and cold, on the dense sinking waters of the Arctic pulling the warm currents north to replace them. But as the ice sheets grew, as glaciers carved and melted in erratic bursts, they poured fresh water into the sea. The balance was upset. The waters grew lighter, refusing to sink. The conveyor stuttered. In the lab below deck, Elias traced the data with a finger. "See this?" He pointed to a graph of past climates, reconstructed from seafloor sediments. Every time the circulation slowed, the North Atlantic froze. Europe plunged into cold. Mara frowned. "How fast?" "Decades," Elias said. "Maybe less." The silence between them was heavy. They both knew what that meant. The Ice Age wasn't just a slow creep of glaciers. It was a thing of fits and starts, of abrupt freezes when the ocean's pulse faltered. And now it was happening again. Above them, the sky darkened. The first flakes of snow spiraled down, landing softly on the deck before vanishing into the brine. Elias turned his face to the wind, imagining the cold front spreading outward, mile by mile, year by year. The ice sheets, sensing the change, would push farther south. The mammoths and caribou would retreat. The world would tighten its frozen grip. But the ocean would remember. Somewhere in the abyss, the current still stirred, sluggish but alive, waiting. The heartbeat hadn't stopped yet. But it was fading. The earth was not always silent. Beneath the ice, beneath the permafrost and the grinding weight of glaciers, the planet's molten heart still stirred. Volcanoes, those great vents of the underworld, punctured the frozen skin of the Ice Age world, spewing fire and ash into the sky. Their eruptions were brief, violent interruptions in the long reign of cold paradoxes of heat in a world defined by ice. Mount Toba, 74,000 years ago, had been the most devastating. A supervolcano, its caldera vast enough to swallow cities, had torn itself apart in a cataclysm that dwarfed all others. Sulfur dioxide and ash geysered into the stratosphere, a black shroud that wrapped the globe. Sunlight faltered, temperatures plummeted. The Ice Age, already deep in its grip, clenched harder. But volcanoes were fickle architects of climate. Their ash cooled the world, yes, but their carbon dioxide warmed it. The same vents that choked the sky with particulates also exhaled greenhouse gases, a slow subterranean breath that accumulated over centuries. Dr. Annika Patel stood at the edge of a steaming fumarole in Iceland, her boots crunching on snow-streaked basalt. The ground here was warm to the touch, even in the depths of winter. Plumes of vapor twisted into the frigid air, carrying the sharp scent of sulfur. "This is where the battle happens," she said to her companion, Dr. Lars Johansson, as she adjusted her gas analyzer. "Fire and ice, right beneath our feet." The device hissed, its screen flickering with readings. CO2, methane, trace gases, all bubbling up from the magma below. Lars crouched beside her, his gloved hand brushing the snow from a patch of bare rock. "You'd think eruptions would just make things colder," he mused. "But it's never that simple, is it?" Annika shook her head. "The ash falls out of the atmosphere in a few years. The CO2 lingers for centuries." She thought of the ice cores, the way they recorded the aftermath of eruptions. First a spike in sulfates, then millennia later, a slow rise in CO2. Volcanoes were time-delayed arsonists, their fires burning long after the initial explosion. The paradox was written in the rocks. In Siberia, the Deccan Traps, ancient flood basalts, had once belched enough CO2 to push the planet out of an ice age and into a hothouse. In Iceland, the Laki fissures of 1783 had chilled Europe with their haze, even as their invisible gases nudged the thermometer upward. And now, in the heart of the Pleistocene, the same forces were at work. Annika and Lars hiked toward the summit of a dormant cone, their breath fogging in the cold. Below them, glaciers sprawled like frozen rivers, their blue-white surfaces scarred by ash from recent eruptions. "Look at that," Lars said, pointing to a dark streak in the ice. "Hekla, maybe? Or Katla?" Annika nodded. "Probably. The ice remembers every one. But the glaciers were shrinking here, retreating from the geothermal heat. Steam rose from crevasses, and at the edges of the ice, tiny flowers, hardy pioneers, pushed through the thawing soil. Fire was melting the ice. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, inexorably. Back at camp, Annika spread out her maps. Red dots marked the volcanic zones. Iceland, the Aleutians, the Andes. Each one a potential trigger, a wild card in the climate's deck. "What happens when the next big one goes off?" Lars asked, handing her a mug of tea. Annika blew on the steaming liquid, considering. "Depends where it is. A tropical eruption could spread ash worldwide, a high-latitude one, maybe just regional cooling. And the CO2?" She sighed. "That's the long game. A big enough spike could shorten the ice age." The thought was unsettling. Humans hadn't yet mastered fire, hadn't yet built cities or cleared forests, but the Earth itself was already capable of altering its own climate, of swinging between frost and furnace with geologic indifference. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the distant rumble of a calving glacier. Somewhere beneath the ice, magma stirred. The fire beneath was patient, but it was never still. The world was restless. Beneath the ice, beneath the oceans and the sprawling tundras, the Earth's crust shifted in a slow, ceaseless dance. Continents, those colossal rafts of rock, drifted apart and collided over eons, their movements measured in centimeters per year, imperceptible to any creature that walked upon them, but undeniable in their consequences. The Ice Age was not just a story of snow and cold. It was a story of gateways opening and closing, of mountain ranges rising, of ocean currents rerouted by the stubborn crawl of land masses. The Isthmus of Panama had been one such gatekeeper. 3 million years before the glaciers claimed the north, this slender bridge had risen from the sea, stitching the Americas together. Its birth had redirected the oceans, severing the warm equatorial flow between the Atlantic and Pacific. The Gulf Stream strengthened, ferrying heat toward the Arctic, where it met the frigid air and fell as snow. Year after year, the snowfall accumulated, compacted, until the first ice sheets groaned into being. Dr. Rafael Silva stood on the rocky shore of Tierra del Fuego, the southernmost tip of South America, where the Andes plunged into the sea. The wind here was a living thing, howling across the strait that had once been closed. In his hand he held a fossil, a tiny shell from an ancient seabed, its curves worn smooth by time. "This was underwater once," he said to his colleague, Dr. Len Nguyenja, who crouched beside him, examining the striated rock face. "Before the land rose, before the currents changed." Lin nodded, brushing sediment from the stone. "And when the gateway closed, the Arctic got colder." Raphael pocketed the fossil, his gaze drifting northward, as if he could see the chain of cause and effect stretching across hemispheres. The Isthmus of Panama had been the first domino. The Ice Age was the last. Elsewhere, the Himalayas told a different tale. The collision of India with Asia had thrust the world's highest peaks into the sky, their snow-capped summits scraping the atmosphere. The mountains were young, geologically speaking, and still growing, a few centimeters taller each year. Their sheer mass disrupted the wind, diverting moisture-laden air northward, where it fell as snow on the waiting glaciers. But the Himalayas did more than just make weather. They were chemical factories, their rocks grinding under the weight of ice and time. As the glaciers chewed through stone, they exposed fresh minerals to the air, silicate rocks that reacted with CO2, pulling the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere and locking it away in carbonate. Dr. Priya Kapoor knelt on a Himalayan moraine, chipping at a vein of granite with her rock hammer. The thin air burned her lungs, but she ignored it, focused on the gleam of mineral in the sunlight. "See this?" she called to her assistant, Anil, holding up the sample. "This is the Earth's thermostat. Weathering. A slow, silent process that had cooled the planet incrementally, nudging it toward the Ice Age." Anil frowned. "But if weathering removes CO2, why don't we just freeze forever?" Priya smiled. "Because the planet fights back. Less CO2 means slower weathering. Volcanoes replenish the gas. It's a balance. A delicate one." And now, with the continent still drifting, the balance was shifting again. In the North Atlantic, another change was unfolding. The slow uplift of Scandinavia, rebounding from the weight of glaciers, was tilting the seafloor. The Denmark Strait, that narrow channel between Greenland and Iceland, was deepening, just enough to alter the flow of cold, dense water that powered the ocean conveyor. On board the research vessel Freya, Dr. Ingrid Sørensen monitored the sonar readings, her brow furrowed. "The sill is sinking," she murmured. "A few millimeters a year, but it adds up." Her first officer, Eric, leaned over her shoulder. "Will it affect the circulation?" Ingrid didn't answer immediately. She thought of the ice cores, the sudden Dansgaard Oshka spikes. The ocean was a capricious beast, sensitive to the slightest nudge. "Maybe," she said at last. "Or maybe the system will compensate. We won't know until it happens." Outside, the sea was gray and choppy, the horizon blurred by mist. Somewhere beneath the waves, the Earth's crust was still moving, still shaping the climate in ways no human could predict. The continents had set the stage for the Ice Age. Now they would decide how it ended. The tundra stretched endlessly under a sky the color of iron, its frozen expanse broken only by the slow, deliberate movements of giants. A woolly mammoth herd trudged across the plain, their massive feet sinking into the snow with each step. The matriarch led them, her tusks curving like ancient scimitars, her shaggy coat matted with frost. Behind her, the calves stayed close, their small trunks occasionally reaching out to touch their mother's sides for reassurance. The wind carried their low rumbles, a language older than the glaciers themselves. Not far away, a saber-toothed cat crouched in the tall, dry grass, its golden eyes fixed on the herd. Its muscles were taut, its breath shallow, the picture of patience. The mammoths were too large to take down alone, but the cat knew their patterns. It had watched them for days, waiting for the moment when one might stray, when age or injury would make one vulnerable. The balance was delicate. The mammoths were architects of their own world. Their constant grazing kept the tundra open, preventing forests from encroaching. Their trampling stirred the soil, encouraging the growth of grasses that fed not only them, but the herds of bison, horses, and reindeer that shared their world. Even in death, they sustained others, their carcasses a feast for scavengers, their bones shelter for smaller creatures. But the saber-tooths were part of the equation too. They culled the weak, the sick, the old. They kept the herds moving, preventing overgrazing in any one area. Their presence was a shadow that shaped the rhythm of life on the tundra. A sudden crack echoed across the plain, ice shifting in a distant river. The mammoths paused, their ears flicking, trunks raised to test the air. The matriarch rumbled a warning, and the herd shifted formation, the adults forming a protective circle around the young. The saber-tooth flattened itself against the ground, its tail twitching. Not today. The hunt would have to wait. As the mammoths moved on, their footsteps left deep impressions in the snow, soon to be filled by the next storm. The cat watched them go, then turned and vanished into the gathering twilight. Above them, the first stars appeared, cold and indifferent. The dance would continue tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, until the world changed again, and when it did, the giants would be the first to fall. The mammoth's breath came in ragged clouds, each exhale a fleeting spectre in the brittle air. She stood alone now, her herd long scattered, some fallen to the spears of the strange upright creatures that had begun to stalk the land, others lost to the slow starvation of a world that no longer knew them. The tundra was changing, the cold was softening, the ice retreating, and the grasses that had once carpeted the earth were giving way to unfamiliar shrubs and trees. Her name, if she had one, was lost to time. But her kind had walked this earth for millions of years, had seen glaciers rise and fall like the breath of some great beast. Now she was among the last. The humans called her Mir, the old word for peace, though there was little of that left in the world. They had come from the south in small, relentless bands, their voices sharp as cracking ice, their weapons cruel and precise. They did not hunt as the saber-tooths did, with the clean efficiency of hunger. They killed in excess, took only the choicest parts, and left the rest to rot. Mir lifted her trunk, testing the wind. The scent of smoke curled through the air, a campfire distant but drawing nearer. She turned away, her massive feet sinking into the thawing earth. The permafrost was no longer solid beneath her. It had grown spongy, treacherous. Once, her kind had thrived in the endless winter, their thick coats shielding them from blizzards, their tusks clearing snow to reach the frozen grasses below. Now, the snow melted too soon, and the new plants were bitter, their leaves laced with toxins her stomach could not digest. A calf's bleat echoed from a nearby thicket, a sound that sent a jolt through Mira's weary heart. She lumbered toward it, pushing through the tangled branches. There, trembling in the shadow of a stunted spruce, stood a young bull, his fur matted with mud, his ribs too prominent beneath his skin. He was not hers, but he was of her kind, and that was enough. She rumbled softly, and he pressed against her side, his small trunk clinging to her fur. The herd instinct, buried deep, stirred once more. But the humans were coming. Their fires dotted the horizon now, flickering like malevolent stars. They moved with a purpose the mammoths could not comprehend, cutting down trees, driving away the game, reshaping the land to fit their needs. They were few, yet their impact was vast, and the world itself seemed to conspire against the great beasts. The summers grew longer, the winters milder. The mammoths' coats, once a shield, became a burden in the unrelenting damp. The bogs swallowed them whole, their massive frames sinking into the mire, their struggles only hastening the end. The humans found them there sometimes, spears raised, but more often it was the land itself that claimed them. Mir led the calf north, toward the remnants of the ice, where the cold still held dominion. But even there the signs were clear. The glaciers were retreating, their edges dripping, their blue hearts exposed. The world was unraveling, and the mammoths, those ancient lords of the ice, were fading with it. Their bones would litter the tundra, their tusks jutting from the thawing ground like the ribs of the earth itself. Some would be preserved in the permafrost, frozen in time, waiting to whisper their stories to a future age. But Mir did not know that. She knew only the weight of her years, the ache in her joints, the calf's trusting touch, and the scent of smoke, ever closer on the wind. Theories of extinction are like footprints in the snow, clear at first, then blurred by time and wind. Was it the humans, with their spears and fire, who hunted the mammoth to oblivion? Or was it the climate, shifting beneath the great beast's feet like cracking ice? Or perhaps most likely, a tangled web of both, a slow unspooling of fate where each strand pulled the others tighter. Dr. Eleanor Varga stood in the Siberian permafrost, her boots sinking slightly into the thawing ground. Before her lay the remains of a woolly mammoth, its bones half submerged in the muck, its tusks jutting upward like the ribs of a sunken ship. The air smelled of wet earth and something older, something almost metallic, time itself, leaching from the ice. Her colleague, Dr. Tomas Kovac, crouched beside the carcass, brushing dirt from a fractured rib. "See these marks?" He pointed to a series of shallow grooves along the bone. "Stone tools. This one was butchered." Eleanor nodded, but her gaze drifted to the surrounding sediment. The layer where the mammoth lay was streaked with dark soil, organic matter from a warmer, wetter period. "It wasn't just the hunters," she murmured. "Look at the pollen samples. The vegetation shifted, the mammoth's food disappeared." Thomas sighed, wiping his hands on his pants. So which was it? Overkill or overchill? The debate had raged for decades. Overkill, the Blitzkrieg hypothesis, argued that humans, armed with superior technology and insatiable appetites, had swept across the continents like a wildfire, slaughtering megafauna too slow to adapt. The evidence was there, kill sites stacked with bones, spear points lodged in ribs, the eerie coincidence of human arrival and megafaunal collapse. But then there was overchill depending on the era. The Ice Age hadn't ended uniformly. It had flickered, its retreat punctuated by violent reversals. Younger Dryas cold snaps, abrupt warming spikes that reshaped entire ecosystems. Grasslands gave way to forests, wetlands dried up. The mammoths, exquisitely adapted to cold steppes, found themselves stranded in a world they no longer recognized. Eleanor knelt, pressing her palm to the permafrost. "It's never just one thing," she said. "Think about it. Humans didn't hunt in a vacuum. They hunted in a world already under stress. The mammoths had thrived for millions of years through countless glaciations. But this time, the climate wasn't their only predator. A third theory lurked in the shadows: the tangled web. Isolated populations, fragmented by shrinking habitats, became vulnerable to disease, inbreeding, bad luck, a single drought, a harsh winter, a band of hunters in the wrong place at the wrong time. Any could have been the final straw. Thomas stood, stretching his back. "So what's the verdict?" Eleanor looked at the mammoth's skull, its hollow eye sockets staring blindly at the sky. "Yes, later, in the lab, the data painted a clearer picture. DNA from the mammoth's teeth showed signs of stress, isotopes indicating malnutrition in its final years. Sediment cores revealed a rapid shift from grassland to shrub tundra around the time of its death, and the carbon dating placed it squarely in the window when humans first appeared in the region. No single factor could explain the extinction, but together they formed a noose." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Outside, the Arctic sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. Somewhere out there, other remnants lay buried, mammoths frozen mid-step, their last meal still in their stomachs, their flesh so well preserved that scientists could still see the color of their fur. They were messages in a bottle, these carcasses. Warnings. The great beasts had survived ice sheets and volcanic winters, only to vanish when the world warmed and a new predator emerged. History didn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymed. The permafrost was a keeper of secrets. Locked in its frozen embrace lay the remnants of a lost world. Bones, fur, even whole creatures flash frozen in time. But the true treasure was far smaller, invisible to the naked eye, strands of ancient DNA, perfectly preserved in the icy depths. Dr. Anya Petrov adjusted her gloves as she peered into the sterile chamber where the latest sample lay. It was a sliver of tissue from a woolly rhinoceros, unearthed from a Siberian riverbank where the thawing permafrost had begun to surrender its dead. The specimen was over 30,000 years old, yet its cells still held the genetic blueprint of a species that had vanished millennia ago. "Look at this," she murmured to her assistant, Mark, pointing to the sequencing screen. The code scrolling across it was fragmented, but unmistakable. Genes for thick fur, fat storage, cold tolerance. This wasn't just an animal, it was a masterpiece of evolution. Mark leaned closer. "Can we tell how it died?" Anya shook her head. "Not from this, but the DNA might tell us why its kind didn't survive." The permafrost was more than a graveyard. It was a library. Every frozen carcass, every scrap of tissue, was a volume in the Earth's genetic archive. And now, as the planet warmed and the ice receded, that archive was opening itself to the modern world. In another lab, half a world away, Dr. Javier Mendez worked with a different kind of relic, ancient plant DNA extracted from sediment cores. The samples were from Greenland, dating back to the last interglacial period when the Arctic had been warmer than today. "Look at the diversity," he said, tracing the genetic markers on his screen. "Birch, alder, even dwarf willow. This wasn't just tundra, it was a shrubland, almost a forest." His colleague, Dr. Ellen Carlson, frowned. And then, Javier pulled up another sequence. Then the Ice Age returned. The cold came back, and the trees vanished. Only the hardiest grasses survived. The implications were unsettling. The permafrost held records not just of life, but of entire ecosystems rising and falling with the climate. The genetic code of long-dead plants could reveal which species had weathered the ice before and which might adapt again as the world warmed anew. But there was danger in the thaw, too. Anya's next sample was darker. A chunk of frozen soil, innocuous at first glance, but teeming with microscopic life, bacteria, and viruses dormant for thousands of years. "These are the hitchhikers," she said, showing Mark the culture plates. Some of the ancient microbes had revived in the lab, their growth slow but undeniable. The permafrost isn't just preserving mammoths, it's preserving their diseases too. Most were harmless. A few were unknown to science. And one, a virus pulled from a 24,000-year-old lemming carcass, had proven infectious to modern cells in preliminary tests. Mark exhaled sharply. "That's not ideal." Anya nodded. "The good news is, it doesn't seem to jump to humans. The bad news is, we don't know what else is out there." The permafrost was melting faster than anyone had predicted. Each summer, new craters opened in the Siberian tundra, the ground collapsing where ice had once held it firm. Rivers ran brown with thawed sediment, and ancient bones tumbled from eroding banks. And with them, perhaps, things best left buried. Yet for all its dangers, the permafrost's greatest gift was its memory. In a remote Alaskan outpost, Dr. Lin Tran pieced together fragments of DNA from a frozen wolf pup, its body curled as if in sleep. The pup had lived during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets stretched as far south as New York. Its genes told a story of adaptation, of a predator evolving to survive in a world of endless winter. But they also told a story of loss. Lin compared the ancient wolf's DNA to that of its modern descendants. The differences were subtle but telling. The Ice Age wolf had been larger, hardier, with a metabolism fine-tuned for cold. Its descendants were smaller, more versatile, adapted not to glaciers but to the patchwork of forests and plains that had replaced them. Evolution had saved the species, but at a cost. She closed the sample jar, labeling it carefully before returning it to the freezer. Outside, the Arctic sun hung low, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere beneath that snow, more secrets waited, more stories frozen in time. The permafrost was the silent witness to an entire age. And now, at last, it was speaking. The night was alive with ghosts. Auroras shimmered across the sky, their green and violet tendrils twisting like spirits in the wind. Beneath them, a band of hunters moved silently across the snow, their breath curling in the frigid air. They were lean and wrapped in furs, their faces painted with ochre to ward off the cold and the unseen. Tor, the eldest among them, raised a hand, halting the group. His dark eyes scanned the tracks ahead, deep, rounded impressions in the snow, already dusted with fresh powder. Mammoth. The others tensed, gripping their spears. The beast had passed this way not long ago, its stride slow and uneven. An old one, perhaps, or injured. Like the youngest, barely more than a boy, shifted his weight, restless. Tor silenced him with a glance. Patience was the first lesson of the hunt. The mammoth would not outrun them now. They followed the trail as the auroras pulsed overhead, their light casting eerie shadows on the snow. The wind carried the scent of pine and something muskier, the animal's sweat, its fear. The hunters moved like shadows, their footfalls soundless, their presence swallowed by the vastness of the tundra. Then a shape in the distance. The mammoth stood at the edge of a frozen lake, its massive head bowed, trunk probing the ice. Its fur was patchy, its ribs visible beneath the shaggy coat. Tor's lips pressed into a thin line. The beast was starving. Winter had been long, the grasses buried too deep beneath the snow. He signaled to the others, spreading them in a wide arc. They would drive it toward the lake, where the ice was thin. Like hesitated, his spear trembling in his grip. Tor caught his eye and nodded once. The boy swallowed hard but stepped forward, his breath quick. The first spear flew. It struck the mammoth's flank, drawing a bellow of pain. The beast reared, its trunk curling, tusks sweeping the air. The hunters closed in, their shouts sharp as cracking ice. The mammoth turned, its massive feet slipping on the frozen ground, then crashed through the lake's brittle surface. Water surged, black and icy. The mammoth thrashed, its cries echoing across the tundra. Tor waded in, his spear raised high. One clean strike to the heart. The beast shuddered, its breath a final plume in the cold air. Then stillness. The hunters stood silent for a moment, their chests heaving. The auroras flickered above, their light reflected in the dark water. Like sank to his knees, his hands shaking. Tor placed a hand on his shoulder. "It is done," he murmured. "The land provides." The others set to work, their knives flashing in the pale light. The mammoth would feed the clan for moons. Its bones would become tools, its hide shelter. Nothing would be wasted. As they butchered, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant howl of a wolf. The hunters paused, listening. The sound was neither threat nor omen, just another voice in the long night. Tor looked up at the sky, where the hunter's moon hung low and heavy. Winter was not over yet, but they would survive. The wind howled through the narrow pass, biting at the hands of the small band of humans huddled beneath an overhang of rock. They had traveled far, following the mammoth herds, but the storm had forced them to take shelter. Now, crouched in the lee of the cliff, they worked with quiet urgency. Rinna, the eldest among them, knelt beside a flat stone, her fingers deftly turning a chunk of flint in her hands. With a precise strike from her hammerstone, a flake sheared away, its edge sharp as a wolf's tooth. She examined it, grunted in satisfaction, and passed it to the younger man beside her. "Here," she said, "for the spear." Kale took the flake, running his thumb along its edge. It was perfect, thin enough to pierce hide, strong enough not to shatter on bone. He bound it to the shaft with sinew, his fingers stiff with cold but steady. Around him, others worked just as diligently, shaping wood, scraping hides, feeding the small fire that flickered defiantly against the storm. Fire, that had been their greatest triumph. It had not come easily. Moon after moon, they had struggled to master it. At first, they had carried embers from lightning-struck trees, sheltering the precious sparks in bundles of dry moss. But when those failed, they had been forced to learn the art of creation. Raina remembered the first time she had seen it done, the way the elder, now long gone, had spun a stick between his palms, pressing it into a groove in a flat piece of wood. Smoke had risen, then a glow, and finally, miraculously, flame. She had practiced for seasons before she could do it herself. Now she could call fire from nothing but friction and patience. And it had changed everything. Fire kept the predators at bay. Fire melted snow into water. Fire hardened spear points and cooked meat, making it easier to chew, safer to eat. Fire lit the caves where they sheltered, where they painted beasts on the walls in ochre and charcoal, as if to capture their spirits before the hunt. But fire was only one of their tools. Kale tested the weight of the finished spear, then nodded to Rinna. "It's good." She smirked. "It'll do." Around them, the others were finishing their tasks. A woman wrapped a newly scraped hide around her shoulders, testing its fit. A man napped another flake from a core, the rhythmic tink-tink of stone on stone blending with the wind's moan. They were not the strongest creatures on the tundra. They were not the fastest. But they were clever. And cleverness, Raina knew as its own kind of strength. When the storm passed, they would move again, following the herds. They would set traps in the snow, track prey over frozen rivers, and when the hunt was done, they would return to their shelters, to fire, to tools, to the slow accumulation of knowledge passed down through generations. The ice had tried to break them. They had answered with flint and flame. The torchlight flickered, casting restless shapes upon the cavern walls. The air was thick with the scent of burning fat and damp stone. In the heart of the earth, where sunlight never reached, the artists worked. Their hands moved with quiet certainty, tracing the contours of beasts, long dead, and those still roaming the frozen world above. Ochre, charcoal, and crushed minerals stained their fingers, red, black, yellow, each hue ground to powder and mixed with animal fat to cling to the stone. A young woman, her face smudged with soot, pressed her palm against the wall and blew pigment through a hollow bone. The outline of her hand emerged, ghostly and eternal, beside the towering form of a bison. Its muscles were taut, its hooves lifted as if frozen mid-charge. "Like this," she murmured, stepping back to examine her work. The elder, a man with eyes like flint, nodded. "The spirit is there," he said. "Now it will always run." Around them, the cave was alive with images. Aurochs with curved horns grazed alongside herds of reindeer, their forms overlapping in a dance of pigment and memory. Horses, their manes wild, galloped across the uneven surface as if fleeing some unseen predator, and high above them all, half hidden in the shadows, a woolly rhinoceros glared down, its horn a slashing arc of black. This was not mere decoration. It was magic. The artists believed the walls were a veil between worlds. By capturing the beasts here, in the sacred dark, they could summon their strength in the hunt above. The bison would be slower, the mammoth more careless, the horses drawn to their spears as if by an invisible thread. But it was more than that, too. The elder dipped his fingers into a bowl of red ochre and drew a line across the stone, a wound, dripping. Beside it, he sketched the crude form of a man, fallen beneath the bison's hooves. "A warning," he said. "The beast is strong. We must be stronger." The young woman studied the image, then added her own marks, tiny strokes around the bison's legs, like grass bending in the wind, life, movement, respect. The torch guttered, its light wavering. The shadows deepened, and for a moment the beasts seemed to breathe, their flanks rising and falling in the flickering glow. Then stillness. The elder placed his hand over the young woman's, their fingers stained with the same colors. "Now they are with us," he said. "Now we are not alone." Above ground, the wind howled across the tundra, carrying with it the scent of snow and distant fires. The hunters would return to these caves, generation after generation, adding their own stories to the stone, and the beasts would run forever. The snow fell in thick, silent waves, muffling the world beneath its weight. A lone figure moved through the storm, his broad shoulders hunched against the wind, his breath steaming in the frigid air. His name was lost to time, but his kind had a name, Homo neanderthalensis. He was strong, built for the cold, thick-boned and muscular, with a heavy brow and a nose designed to warm the air before it reached his lungs. His cloak was made of wolf hide, stitched together with sinew, the fur turned inward for warmth. In one hand he carried a spear, its tip sharpened to a deadly point. The Neanderthal paused, his dark eyes scanning the white expanse. The herd had passed this way, reindeer, their hoofprints already filling with snow. He could smell them on the wind, the musky scent of their fur, the sharp tang of their fear. He would not hunt today. The storm was too fierce, the light too dim. But he marked the trail in his mind, a map only he could read. The cave was a welcome respite. The walls were blackened by generations of fires, the floor littered with bones and tools. His mate sat near the hearth, grinding dried meat between two stones. Their child, a boy of 5 winters, played with a carved figurine, a mammoth, its shape rough but recognizable. The Neanderthal crouched by the fire, holding his hands to the flames. His mate grunted a greeting, then handed him a strip of meat. It was tough but nourishing, flavored with herbs she had gathered in the brief summer. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire crackled. They did not speak as humans would. Their language was older, simpler. Grunts, gestures, the tilt of a head conveying meaning. But it was enough. The child crawled into his lap, clutching the mammoth figurine. The Neanderthal rumbled deep in his chest, a sound of comfort. He traced the shape of the carving with a calloused finger, then pointed to the cave wall, where ochre handprints and crude beasts flickered in the firelight. The child's eyes widened. He understood. These were their stories, their memories, their magic. But the world was changing. The Neanderthal had seen the signs, the strange tracks in the snow, the unfamiliar scents on the wind. Others were moving into their lands, taller, slimmer, their voices sharp and quick, Homo sapiens. They were clever, these newcomers. Their tools were finer, their spears flew farther. They came in greater numbers, their camps sprawling across the valleys. The Neanderthal did not fear them, but he watched. His mate handed him another strip of meat. He chewed slowly, thinking. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was coming. The child curled against him, warm and trusting. The fire burned low, and the snow kept falling. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, pulsing glow across the cave walls. The Neanderthal sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the entrance where the wind howled like a living thing. His mate slept beside him, her breath steady, their child curled between them. But he could not sleep. His thoughts were of the newcomers, the Homo sapiens, who had begun to appear along the edges of their hunting grounds. He had watched them from a distance, these tall, slender figures with their strange weapons and their endless chatter. They moved differently, hunted differently. They took more than they needed, and they were everywhere. The Neanderthal exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. His kind had walked these lands for hundreds of thousands of years, surviving ice and hunger, mastering the snow and the silence. They had no name for themselves, no concept of extinction, but something in his bones told him the balance had shifted. The child stirred, murmuring in his sleep. The Neanderthal placed a broad hand on his back, soothing him. Outside, the storm raged on. The thaw came too soon that year. The snow melted into slush, the rivers swelled with runoff, and the reindeer herds scattered, their migration patterns disrupted. The Neanderthals followed them anyway, tracking their thinning numbers across the sodden tundra. Game was scarcer now, the land less generous. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the Neanderthal crouched beside a stream, washing the blood from his hands after a meager kill, a hare, barely enough to feed his family. The water was icy, his fingers numb, but he scrubbed until the stains were gone. Then he heard it. Laughter. Human laughter. He turned, his muscles tense. A band of Homo sapiens stood on the opposite bank, their faces painted with ochre, their spears tipped with finely worked stone. They hadn't seen him yet. They were too busy celebrating, passing around a skin of something that made their voices loud and their movements careless. One of them, a young man with a braided beard, suddenly looked up. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the human grinned, raising his spear in a mock salute. The others turned, their laughter fading into curiosity. The Neanderthal stood slowly, water dripping from his hands. He did not smile. He did not raise his own weapon. He simply stared, letting the silence stretch between them. The humans exchanged glances. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes, said something low and quick, and the group gathered their things, moving off into the gathering dusk. But the moment lingered. The Neanderthal watched them go, his chest tight. He had seen the way they looked at him, not with fear, not with hatred, but with something worse. Indifference. That winter was the hardest yet. The cold returned with a vengeance, but the game did not. The herds had dwindled, pushed south or hunted to scarcity. The Neanderthals ranged farther, their footsteps heavy with exhaustion. One night, his mate did not rise from her sleeping furs. Her breath was shallow, her skin hot to the touch. The child whimpered, pressing close to her side. The Neanderthal knelt beside her, his hands hovering uselessly. He had seen sickness before, had lost kin to coughing fevers and wasting ailments, but this felt different. Final. She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek. Her lips moved, shaping a sound he knew well, his name or the closest thing to it. Then her hand fell. The fire crackled. The child began to cry. By spring, they were alone. The Neanderthal and his son walked the empty valleys, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The humans had moved deeper into their territory, their camps sprawling, their fires burning bright. The child was thinner now, his eyes too large for his face. The Neanderthal carried him when his legs grew weak, his own strength waning with each passing day. One evening, they found a cave, small but sheltered. The Neanderthal built a fire, the last of their kindling burning low. He fed the child scraps of dried meat, then wrapped him in the last of their furs. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant. The Neanderthal sat by the fire, watching the shadows dance on the walls. He thought of his mate, of the others who had once walked these lands. He thought of the humans, with their endless voices and their clever hands. And then he did something he had never done before. He reached into the ashes, smearing his fingers with soot, and pressed his hand against the cave wall. The mark was dark, stark against the stone. A memory. A farewell. The child stirred, murmuring in his sleep. The Neanderthal gathered him close, holding him against the night's chill. The fire burned lower, and somewhere, far away, the wind carried the sound of human voices, laughing. The wind scoured the tundra, a relentless force that bent the few stubborn plants clinging to the thin soil. Among the rocks and ice, life persisted in pockets of defiance, microclimates where the sun's weak warmth pooled, where meltwater trickled just long enough to sustain a tenacious few. Here, In the lee of a boulder, a cluster of Arctic poppies huddled, their golden faces turned toward the pale light. Their stems were short, their leaves thick and waxy, an armor against the cold. They had no time for grandeur. Their beauty was efficiency, their survival a quiet rebellion. A lemming scurried past, its fur fluffed against the chill. It paused to nibble at a patch of moss, then vanished into a labyrinth of tunnels beneath the snow. The plants paid it no mind. They had other concerns. Winter was coming again. The poppies had already begun their preparations. Their seeds, tiny and dark, were encased in hardened pods, designed to withstand freezing and thawing, to lie dormant for years if necessary. When the time was right, they would scatter, some carried by the wind, some clinging to the fur of passing animals, some simply falling to the earth to wait. They were the seed keepers, the silent guardians of the next spring. Not all plants relied on chance. In a sheltered valley where geothermal warmth seeped from the ground, a dwarf willow sprawled low to the earth, its branches gnarled and twisted by centuries of wind. It was ancient, this willow, older than the mammoth bones buried nearby, older than the glaciers that had once ground over this very spot. Each autumn, it released its seeds in a flurry of white down, trusting the wind to carry them to new refuges. But it also sent out runners, creeping stems that took root and grew into clones of the parent. If one patch perished, another would survive. The willow did not hurry. It had learned patience. The true masters of endurance, though, were the lichens. Crusting the rocks in splashes of orange, gray, and green, they were not one organism but two, fungus and algae entwined in a partnership older than the Ice Age itself. They needed no soil, only light and air. They grew slowly, imperceptibly, their lives measured in centuries rather than seasons. When the snow buried them, they slept. When the thaw came, they awoke. They were the Earth's first colonists, the last survivors. On the edge of a melting ice sheet, a scientist knelt, her fingers brushing a patch of moss just emerging from the frost. Dr. Elara Voss had spent years studying these microclimates, these pockets of resilience. She carefully scraped a sample into a vial, labeling it with the coordinates and date. "Look at this," she murmured to her colleague Henrik, holding up the moss. "It was frozen for decades, maybe centuries, and it's still alive." Henrik crouched beside her, his breath fogging in the cold air. "How?" Elara smiled. "They're built for this. Desiccation tolerance. Cryoprotectants in their cells. They dry out, freeze solid, and just wait." She placed the sample in her pack, her gaze drifting across the landscape. The tundra was a mosaic of survivors, plants that had weathered countless glaciations, that had watched mammoths and Neanderthals pass into memory, and they would outlast her too. That night, as the auroras shimmered overhead, the wind scattered a handful of seeds across the snow. Some would perish, some would lie dormant until the world warmed again, and some would find their way to another sheltered crevice, another fleeting pocket of warmth. The seed keepers had patience. They knew how to wait. The caribou moved like shadows across the tundra, their hooves crunching through the brittle crust of snow. 1,000 strong, they flowed in an unbroken river of fur and antlers, following paths worn deep into the permafrost by generations before them. Their breath misted in the frigid air, a living cloud that hovered above the herd as they pressed northward, driven by an instinct older than memory. At the front of the herd, an old bull with a scarred flank paused, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. The scent of wolves lingered faintly on the breeze, but it was distant, no threat yet. Beyond the next ridge lay the calving grounds, where the snow would be thinner and the first tender shoots of spring would push through the thawing earth. He lowered his head and pressed on. Behind him, the herd followed without hesitation. The young, still wobbly on their long legs, stayed close to their mothers. The pregnant cows moved with deliberate care, their sides heavy with the promise of new life. They had walked this path before, some of them a dozen times. The land was their map, written in the language of wind and ice. To the east, a smaller group of reindeer picked their way across a frozen lake, their wide hooves splayed for balance. The Sami herder, Ailu, walked beside them, his boots silent on the ice. He knew these animals as well as he knew his own breath, each one's temperament, its strength, its weaknesses. His grandfather had taught him the old ways, how to listen for the creak of thinning ice, how to find the lichen buried beneath the snow, how to sing the songs that would calm a spooked calf. The reindeer were not just his livelihood, they were his kin, bound to him by centuries of shared survival. Ailu's lead doe Riston paused and turned her head toward him, her dark eyes knowing. He murmured her name, and she huffed softly before continuing. The herd trusted him, and he trusted the land to guide them. The caribou and reindeer did not know that their migrations were ancient beyond reckoning. They did not know that their hooves had carved highways into the earth, that their trails had shaped the journeys of wolves and foxes, of ravens and bears. They did not know that in the depths of the Ice Age, their ancestors had walked these same paths beneath the gaze of woolly mammoths and cave lions. They only knew the pull of the seasons, the need to move. As the herd crested the ridge, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest hint of green. The old bull quickened his pace. Spring was coming, and the frozen river of life would flow on. The night was endless, a vast expanse of darkness broken only by the silver glow of the moon. The wind howled across the tundra, a sound like the earth itself crying out, a chorus of hunger and desperation. In the hollow between two frozen ridges, a pack of wolves moved like ghosts. Their fur was thick, their ribs just visible beneath the shaggy coats. The alpha, a massive male with a grizzled muzzle, lifted his nose to the air, scenting for prey. The pack followed his lead, their yellow eyes gleaming in the moonlight. They had not eaten in days. A mile away, a pride of cave lions stalked the same stretch of land. The largest, a female with a scarred shoulder, crouched low in the snow, her muscles coiled. Her cubs waited behind her, their small bodies shivering. The wind carried the scent of caribou, weak, old, perhaps injured, a worthy target if they could reach it before the wolves. The hunt was a dance of desperation, a battle against the cold as much as against each other. The wolves struck first. They moved as one, a blur of gray and white, their howls splitting the night. The caribou, an old bull with a lame leg, bolted, but the wolves were faster. The alpha lunged, his jaws closing around the bull's hindquarters. The others swarmed, pulling it down in a flurry of snow and blood. The cave lions too late watched from the shadows. The female snarled, her tail lashing. She could challenge the wolves, but not without risk. Her cubs were too young to fight, too weak to survive if she fell. She turned away, her growl fading into the wind. The wolves feasted, their muzzles red, their bellies finally full. The wind carried the scent of their kill for miles, a beacon for scavengers. And somewhere in the distance, the last echoes of the cave lion's roar lingered, a fading reminder of a world where predators ruled the frozen night. But the wind did not care. It only howled on. The glacier's edge was a wall of blue, its surface scarred by time and weather. Carlyle stood before it, his breath curling in the frigid air. The ice stretched endlessly in both directions, a frozen river that had carved mountains and valleys over millennia. But here, at its terminus, the glacier was shrinking, retreating year by year, leaving behind raw earth and scattered boulders. He reached out, pressing his palm against the ice. The cold bit through his gloves, sharp and immediate. For a moment he imagined he could feel the glacier's pulse, the slow, inexorable movement of its heart. Then he noticed his reflection. The ice was not perfectly smooth but warped and rippled like ancient glass. His face stared back at him, distorted, fragmented, yet undeniably human. Behind his reflection, the world stretched out in shades of white and gray, the tundra, the distant mountains, the sky heavy with snow. A mirror, a question. Humans had not always been here, not like this. Once, they had been small, insignificant creatures clinging to the edges of a world ruled by ice. They had huddled in caves, chased mammoths across frozen plains, painted their dreams on stone. They had been part of the balance, one thread in a vast and intricate web. Now, they were unraveling it. Cale pulled his hand away, watching as the faint warmth of his touch left a fleeting mark on the ice. It would freeze over again, of course. The glacier was patient. But for how long? The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke, not from a campfire, but from the distant settlements where his people had begun to burn wood in quantities that would have stunned their ancestors, where they felled forests, tilled fields, built walls to keep out the cold and the wild. Progress, they called it. Cale wasn't sure. He turned away from the glacier, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. A raven circled overhead, its black wings stark against the pale sky. It cawed once, a sound like cracking ice, then vanished into the wind. Cale had heard the elders speak of cycles of ice ages and interglacials, of warmth and cold, chasing each other across the millennia like wolves after their prey. The earth had its rhythms, its seasons writ large. But humans were changing the rhythm. They were no longer just surviving the ice. They were shaping it. And Cale wondered, as he walked back toward the smoke and the noise, what the glacier would remember of them. Would it recall their hands, their fires, their hunger? Or would it simply keep moving, slow and implacable, until their marks upon the land were ground to dust beneath its weight? The ice did not answer. It only reflected. The world was waking. At first the change was imperceptible, a softening of the wind, a slight thinning of the snow. But as the centuries unfurled, the signs grew undeniable. The glaciers, once relentless in their advance, began to withdraw, their edges dripping meltwater into newborn streams. The ice groaned as it retreated, fissures splitting its surface like cracks in a mirror. Where the glaciers had been, the land lay raw and exposed. Scoured bedrock gleamed under the sun, polished smooth by millennia of grinding ice. Moraines, piles of rubble pushed aside by the glacier's passage, marked their former boundaries like grave markers, and between them, meltwater pooled into vast glassy lakes, their surfaces reflecting the pale sky. The air smelled different now. No longer the sharp, sterile scent of ice, but something richer. Wet earth, decaying vegetation, the faint metallic tang of minerals leaching from freshly exposed stone. Life surged into the void. At the edge of a retreating glacier, a patch of bare ground steamed in the sunlight. Tiny green shoots pushed through the damp soil, their leaves unfurling with desperate haste. They were pioneers, hardy grasses, mosses and lichens that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for this moment. A lemming scurried across the newly exposed earth, its nose twitching. It paused to nibble at a tender shoot, then vanished into a nearby thicket of dwarf willow, already spreading its roots into the thawing ground. The first tree in 1,000 years. The rivers, unchained from their icy prisons, carved new paths through the land. Their waters ran gray with glacial silt, carrying the pulverized remains of mountains toward distant seas. In their currents, fish darted, salmon returning to ancestral spawning grounds they had never seen, guided by some ancient memory. Along the banks, reeds sprang up, their roots knitting the loose soil together. Frogs, frozen in the mud through the long winter, thawed and stirred, their sluggish hearts quickening with the warmth. And overhead, birds returned, geese in ragged V formations, their cries echoing across the open water, swallows darting low over the marshes, raptors circling on updrafts, their keen eyes scanning for movement in the green below. The world was stitching itself back together. But not all the changes were gentle. In the high valleys, where the glaciers had clung the longest, their retreat left behind unstable slopes. Rocks, no longer held in place by ice, tumbled down in sudden thunderous avalanches. Meltwater pooled behind natural dams of debris, only to burst free in catastrophic floods that scoured the land anew. And beneath it all, the permafrost was softening. In the lowlands, the ground sagged where ice lenses melted, forming thermokarst ponds that grew wider with each passing summer. Methane bubbled up from the thawing muck, its release silent but potent, a greenhouse gas stirring after millennia of sleep. The earth itself was exhaling. A lone wolf stood on a ridge overlooking the changing landscape. Its golden eyes tracked the movement below, the darting shapes of hares, the slow procession of caribou, the glint of water where none had been before. It did not understand the thaw, but it knew this. The world was different now. The pack would have to adapt. The wolf lifted its muzzle and howled, its voice carrying across the newborn lakes, the greening valleys, the retreating ice. A farewell, a greeting, the song of a world reborn. The forests returned in whispers at first, stubborn birch and pine seedlings pushing through the thawed soil, their roots threading through the bones of the old world. Then, as the centuries passed, the whispers became a roar, canopies thickened, swallowing the tundra whole. Mosses carpeted the ground where ice had once ruled, and ferns unfurled in the damp shadows. A river, newly unchained from its glacial leash, carved a fresh path through the valley. Its waters, once milky with silt, ran clear now, polishing stones into smooth, dark jewels. Salmon surged upstream, their silver bodies flashing as they fought the current. Bears waded into the shallows, their paws swift and sure, while otters twisted playfully in the eddies. The river was alive, singing with the sound of a world remade. Life did not merely return, it erupted. Herds of deer, no longer bound to the sparse lichen of the tundra, feasted on tender shoots and bark. Wolves followed, their howls echoing through the green twilight. Birds nested in branches that had not existed for millennia, their songs weaving through the leaves. Even the air itself changed, thick with the scent of resin and damp earth, of blossoms opening to a sun that no longer felt like a stranger. But the thaw was not kind to all. On the shores of a newborn lake, the remains of a woolly mammoth lay half submerged in the peat. Its tusks, bleached by time, pointed skyward like the masts of a sunken ship. The water had preserved it, skin, fur, even the last meal in its stomach, a snapshot of a vanishing age. Now, as the permafrost released its grip, the mammoth slowly sank into the mire, its body returning to the earth that had once sustained it. Nearby, a sapling stretched its roots deeper, drinking the nutrients of decay. The past nourished the future. In the high latitudes, where the ice still clung in shrinking patches, the land bore the scars of its passage. Moraines curved like frozen waves, and erratic boulders carried hundreds of miles by glaciers stood as lonely sentinels in empty fields. The wind, no longer howling across an endless white expanse, now carried the rustle of leaves and the drone of insects. A fox, red-furred and sleek, picked its way through the undergrowth. Its ancestors had worn white coats, hunted lemmings on open snow. Now, it stalked mice in the ferns, its ears pricked for new dangers. Lynx in the trees, boar in the thickets. Adaptation was the price of survival. And in the deepest caves, where the last Neanderthals had once sheltered, stalactites dripped with timeless patience. The ochre handprints on the walls remained, their meaning lost but their presence enduring. The world outside had changed, but here in the silence, the past lingered. The thaw was not an end, it was a turning. The ice had shaped the land, and now the land remembered in the curves of rivers, in the soil of valleys, in the roots of forests that would one day feed new glaciers. The cycle continued, and life, relentless and resilient, marched on. The land remembered, even as the ice retreated, leaving behind a world reborn. The scars of its passage remained, etched into stone, carved into valleys, pressed into the earth like the fingerprints of gods. These were the ghost landscapes, the silent witnesses to an age of cold. Moraines rose in ragged ridges, their slopes strewn with boulders and gravel, debris dumped by glaciers as they melted. Drumlins, smooth and elongated like sleeping whales, dotted the plains, their streamlined shapes telling of ice moving relentlessly over them, sculpting them into forms that defied erosion. Kettle lakes shimmered in hollows where chunks of ice had been buried in sediment, then melted, leaving behind deep, still waters, and everywhere erratic boulders perched improbably on the landscape, their presence a riddle. These were stones torn from distant mountains, carried for miles atop the glaciers, then abandoned when the ice withdrew. They sat like tombstones, marking the glacier's farthest reach. Dr. Elias Carter knelt beside one such boulder in what had once been the terminal zone of the Laurentide ice sheet. He ran his fingers over its pocked surface, tracing the striations, parallel grooves carved by debris dragged beneath the ice. "Look at this," he murmured to his colleague Mara, who crouched beside him. "This rock came from hundreds of miles north. The glacier carried it here like a river carries silt." Mara nodded, brushing dirt from the base of the boulder. "And then it just left it." Elias stood, scanning the horizon. The land here was a palimpsest, layer upon layer of ice's handiwork. The moraines, the drumlins, the erratic boulders, all were fragments of a story written in stone, a story of unimaginable force. Further south, in the outwash plains, the tale was different. Here, meltwater had roared across the land in braided rivers, depositing sand and gravel in vast flat expanses. The soil was poor, the vegetation sparse, a legacy of the glacier's last turbulent breaths. But even here, life had found a way. A lone spruce tree, stunted and twisted by wind, clung to a rocky outcrop. Its roots gripped the thin soil with tenacity, its needles whispering in the breeze. Around it, lichens crusted the stones, and hardy grasses swayed, their seeds carried on the wind from distant, greener lands. The tree did not know it stood on a battlefield. It did not know that beneath its roots lay the remnants of a frozen titan, that the land it called home had been shaped by forces beyond comprehension. It only knew how to grow. In the Great Lakes Basin, the ghost landscapes took on water. The glaciers had gouged deep depressions into the earth, and as they melted, these hollows filled, becoming the largest freshwater system in the world. The shorelines were still adjusting, rebounding from the weight of vanished ice, rising inch by inch over centuries. On the stony beach of Lake Superior, Dr. Lin Tran picked up a smoothed pebble, its edges rounded by ancient waves. "This was all under ice once," she said, turning the stone in her hand. "Now it's a beach where people swim in summer." Her assistant Javier squinted at the horizon. "Hard to imagine." Lynn smiled. "The ice never really leaves. It just changes form." The lakes were its legacy, a reservoir of meltwater so vast it could be seen from space, and in their depths, the glacier's fingerprints lingered, submerged moraines, drowned valleys, sediments that recorded every pulse of the thaw. The wind moved ceaselessly over the ghost landscapes, carrying with it the echoes of ice. It sighed through the moraines, hummed over the drumlins, rippled the surfaces of Kettle Lakes. If you listened closely, you could almost hear it, the creak and groan of glaciers long gone, the rumble of meltwater rivers, the silence of snow piling over centuries. The land remembered, and it would never forget. The sea was reclaiming what the ice had stolen. For millennia, the oceans had been bound in frozen chains, their waters locked away in towering glaciers and sprawling ice sheets. But now, as the world warmed, the ice surrendered its hoard. Meltwater gushed from the edges of retreating glaciers, carving channels through the land before joining the swelling tides. The seas rose, inch by relentless inch, swallowing coastlines whole. On the shores of what would one day be called Doggerland, a vast plain now drowning beneath the North Sea, the last stands of forest clung to the rising waters. Oak and hazel, their roots drinking from freshwater springs, stood sentinel over a landscape in flux. The people who had hunted here for generations watched as the salt crept closer, turning their trails into bogs, their camps into islands. An old fisherman, his skin leathered by wind and sun, dragged his canoe onto a shrinking stretch of beach. He glanced at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in an unbroken line. His father had spoken of a time when the land stretched much farther, when the reindeer herds had crossed great plains now submerged. The old man had scoffed then, now he understood. He placed a hand on the trunk of a dying oak, its bark slick with brine. Soon, he murmured, though whether to the tree or himself, he did not know. The tide did not answer. It only rose. Far to the south, where the Mediterranean licked at the edges of fertile valleys, the waters advanced with quieter hunger. Villages built on bluffs found themselves on sudden cliffs as the shore eroded beneath them. Fishermen returned to find their boats moored in deeper water, their familiar landmarks half submerged. In one such village, a young girl knelt at the water's edge, her fingers tracing the outline of a footprint pressed into the mud, her own, from the day before, now smoothed and blurred by the rising tide. She looked up as her mother called her name, sharp with warning. "Come away," the woman said, pulling her back from the lapping waves. "The sea is greedy today." The girl frowned. "Will it take our house?" Her mother hesitated, then squeezed her hand. "Not today." But they both knew the truth. The sea was patient, and it never stopped. The rising tides reshaped more than land. In the Sunder Shelf, where a vast subcontinent once connected islands now separate, the waters severed ancient migration routes. Tigers and elephants, stranded on shrinking patches of forest, watched as the channels between islands widened. The people who had walked from Sumatra to Java in the dry cold of the Ice Age now took to boats, their songs carrying over the waves, and in the far north, where the Bering Land Bridge had once allowed humans and beasts to cross from Asia to the Americas, the sea reclaimed its dominion. The last mammoths on Wrangel Island, isolated by the rising waters, dwindled and died, their bones left to bleach in the sun. The tides carried no malice. They simply obeyed the laws of physics, filling the spaces the ice had vacated. But in their rise, they rewrote the maps of the world, drowning forests and plains, turning peninsulas into islands, and reshaping the destiny of every creature that walked the earth. On a beach in what would one day be Denmark, a child picked up a strange object, curved, heavy, pitted with age. A mammoth tusk washed ashore from some drowned graveyard. The child turned it over in her hands, marveling at its weight, its texture. Her mother took it from her gently. "This is from the old world," she said, "before the water came." The child frowned. "Will the water take our world too?" The mother looked out at the horizon, where the sea and sky blurred together. She had no answer. Above them, a gull cried, its voice lost in the wind. And the tide kept rising. The land was changing, and so were its people. From the south they came, small bands of Homo sapiens following the retreating ice, their footsteps tracing paths that would one day become highways. They carried spears tipped with finely worked stone, wore cloaks stitched from hides, and spoke in tongues that wove through the wind like songs. The world they entered was vast and untamed, a place of melting glaciers and newborn rivers, of forests creeping northward and herds shifting with the seasons. At the edge of a broad valley where the last fingers of ice still clung to the northern slopes, a group of newcomers paused. The leader, a woman named Syra, lifted her hand, signaling the others to stop. Before them stretched a land of rolling hills and shallow lakes, the water glittering under the pale sun. The air smelled of damp earth and green things growing, a scent unfamiliar after generations spent in the harsher south. "This is good," Syra murmured. Her brother Kale crouched beside a patch of soft soil, pressing his fingers into the earth. "The ground is warm," he said. "Game will be plentiful." Behind them, the others murmured in agreement. They had traveled far, crossing mountains and frozen plains, always following the promise of a land less cruel than the one they had left. Now, they had found it. But they were not the first. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. A fire pit, long cold, its stones blackened by flames. A flint flake, sharp-edged and purposeful, lying beside a stream. And, most telling of all, the bones. Syra knelt beside the remains of a reindeer, its skull split open to extract the marrow. The cuts were clean, precise, the work of skilled hands, but the tools were different from hers. Cruder, older. "Others were here," she said. Kale nodded, his expression unreadable. "The ones who came before. The Neanderthals." Their presence lingered like a whisper in the land, a shadow already fading. Syra had heard stories of them, tales passed down from the elders. They were strong, those other humans, built for the cold, but they moved differently, spoke differently, hunted differently. And now, as the ice retreated, they were retreating too, withdrawing into the deepest valleys, the highest caves. Syra touched the reindeer bone, then stood. "We will stay," she decided, "but we will respect their places." The others murmured agreement. The land was vast enough for all. For now, as the days lengthened, the newcomers settled into the rhythm of the valley. They built shelters from bent saplings and hides, dug pits to store food, and set snares for hares and foxes. The children splashed in the shallows of the lakes, their laughter mingling with the calls of waterfowl. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Syra climbed a low ridge and looked north. In the distance, smoke curled into the sky, not from her people's fires, but from another camp. She watched it for a long moment, then turned away. The world was wide, but it was growing smaller. Generations later, the valley would be thick with the descendants of Syra's band. Their tools would grow finer, their settlements larger. They would paint their stories on cave walls, bury their dead with beads of carved bone, and sing of the time when the ice ruled the earth. And the Neanderthals? Their fires would gutter out one by one, until only their bones remained, hidden in the deepest caves, buried beneath layers of time. But that was a story for another age. For now the newcomers walked the thawing land, their footsteps light upon the earth, and the wind carried their voices into the future. The wind cut through the valley like a blade, howling between the rocks and carrying the scent of snow from the distant peaks. He walked alone, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold, his feet leaving deep impressions in the softening earth. His name had been spoken only in the quiet of caves, in the murmurs of his kin now gone. There was no one left to say it. He was the last. The Neanderthal paused at the edge of a frozen stream, his dark eyes scanning the landscape. The ice was retreating, the land changing. Forests crept closer each season, their shadows swallowing the open tundra where his people had once hunted mammoth and reindeer. The herds grew scarce, their paths shifting with the thaw. The world he knew was unraveling. He knelt, pressing a hand to the damp earth. The scent of moss and wet stone filled his nostrils, familiar and comforting. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called a sound his mother had once imitated to make him laugh. He closed his eyes, listening. Memories flickered like firelight. The warmth of the clan gathered in the cave, the taste of roasted meat, the low hum of voices telling stories he could no longer recall, the laughter of children, now silent. The last winter had taken them, the coughing sickness that burned through the group like wildfire. He had buried them one by one in the rocky crevices, their bodies wrapped in hides, their tools laid beside them for the journey. And then there was only him. The wind shifted, carrying another scent. Smoke. Human smoke. He tensed, his grip tightening on his spear. The newcomers had been drifting into these lands for years, their camps spreading like lichen on stone. They were not like him. Taller, slimmer, their words quick and sharp as cracking ice. They did not fear him, but they did not understand him either. Once he had watched from a ridge as they danced around a fire, their voices rising in a song that held no meaning for him. He could have joined them. Perhaps they would have allowed it, but he did not belong to their world. He turned away from the stream, his footsteps leading him higher into the mountains, where the air was thin and the cold still bit deep. The snow here was older, the land less changed. He climbed until his muscles burned, until the valley below was a distant smudge of green and gray. At the mouth of a shallow cave, he stopped. The walls bore the faintest traces of ochre, handprints, the outline of a bear, symbols older than memory. His people had sheltered here once, long before him. He knelt, running his fingers over the marks, as if he could absorb their meaning through touch. Outside, the first flakes of a new storm began to fall. He built a small fire at the cave's entrance, the flames flickering weakly against the gathering dark. The warmth was meager, but it was enough. He ate the last of his dried meat, savoring the salt on his tongue, then curled on his side, his fur cloak pulled tight around him. The fire burned lower, the snow whispered against the stone, and somewhere in the silence, between the fading embers and the endless cold, the last Neanderthal closed his eyes. The wind howled on. But the world had already moved forward without him. The land was restless, stirring with new rhythms. For generations, the people had followed the herds, their lives bound to the ebb and flow of migration. But now, as the ice retreated and the forests thickened, the old ways were shifting. The earth, once a stage for the hunt, had become something more, a partner, a provider. In a sheltered valley where the soil was rich and dark, a woman named Lyra knelt beside a patch of disturbed earth. Her fingers pressed a seed into the ground, then smoothed the soil over it. Around her, the first shoots of the season pushed through the earth. Barley, emmer wheat, and lentils, their leaves pale but determined. Her daughter Nessa crouched beside her, watching with wide eyes. "Will it grow?" she asked, her voice hushed as if speaking too loudly might scare the plants away. Lyra smiled. "If the sun is kind, and the rain comes." It was not the first time they had tried this. The year before they had scattered seeds along the riverbank, only to watch the floods wash them away. But this place was different. Higher ground, protected by the slope of the hills, where the water soaked in but did not drown. And the seeds had come from the wild grasses that grew in abundance here, their grains gathered and saved, their best traits chosen by hands that were learning to read the land in a new way. Across the valley, Lyra's brother, Torin, worked with a group of men to clear another plot. Their stone hoes bit into the earth, turning the soil, breaking the roots of weeds that would compete with their crops. It was hard labor, harder than hunting, but there was a promise in it, a promise of stability, of food that did not flee when the seasons changed. One of the men paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "The deer won't like this," he grunted, nodding toward the forest edge where a pair of does watched them warily. Torin shrugged. "Then we'll plant more." The old ways were not gone. They still hunted, still gathered, still followed the herds when the time was right. But the balance had tilted. The land could give more than they had ever asked of it before. That evening, the clan gathered around the central fire, the scent of roasting grain mingling with the wood smoke. Lyra passed a clay bowl of porridge to Nessa, who blew on it eagerly before taking a tentative sip. "It's good," she declared, and the others laughed. It was simple fare, But it was theirs, grown from the earth they had tended, harvested by their own hands, the first fruits of a new covenant between people and land. Lyra looked around the circle at the faces lit by firelight, at the children who would never know the hunger of endless winters, at the elders who had lived to see this strange new chapter unfold. The world was changing, and they were changing with it. In the years to come, the fields would spread. The first crude huts would give way to sturdy houses, their walls made of mud brick, their roofs thatched with reeds. The wild grasses would become crops, their seeds larger, their stalks stronger, shaped by generations of careful selection. The people would no longer be just hunters, just wanderers. They would be farmers, and the earth, once a silent partner in their survival, would become the foundation of their future. But for now, in this quiet valley under a sky streaked with the last light of dusk, it was enough to plant a seed and watch it grow. The first step in a journey that would reshape the world. The fire crackled low in the center of the hut, its light flickering against the painted hides stretched across the walls. The elders sat in a circle, their faces lined with years, their eyes sharp as flint. Outside, the wind whispered through the barley fields, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain. The youngest among them, a boy named Aaron, leaned forward, his hands clenched in his lap. "Tell it again," he said, "the story of the great cold." Old Vessa sighed, her fingers tracing the spiral carved into her walking stick. "You've heard it 100 times, child. But I need to hear it again," Aaron insisted. "Before I forget." A murmur passed through the elders. Forgetting was the enemy. So Vessa began. Long ago, before the first seeds were planted, before the first houses were built, the world was covered in ice, white as far as the eye could see, deeper than the tallest tree, and so cold it could freeze a man's breath before it left his lips. Aaron shivered, though the hut was warm. The glaciers were alive, Vessa continued. They groaned like beasts. They moved like rivers, but slower, so slow you couldn't see it, only feel it in your bones. They carved valleys where none had been, crushed mountains into dust, and when they melted, they left behind lakes, so vast you could sail for days and not see the other side. She paused, her gaze distant. Our ancestors lived in the shadow of the ice. They followed the herds, mammoths tall as 2 men, reindeer in numbers like clouds. They painted their stories on cave walls so the spirits would remember them. And they survived. Aaron frowned. How? By listening. Vessa tapped her temple. The land spoke to them. The wind told them when storms were coming. The behavior of the animals warned them of changes. They remembered the paths of the stars, the taste of the air before a blizzard, and they passed that knowledge down, mother to child, elder to youth, like a flame that must never go out. Other voices joined hers now, layering the story with details passed through generations. "The seas were lower then," murmured Jaw, "the oldest of them. You could walk from here to the eastern lands where the sun rises. Now, that path is underwater, and the sky flickered with strange lights," added Lyra, her hands weaving shapes in the air, green and purple, dancing like spirits. The cold brought them. Aaron's eyes widened. "Will the ice come back?" The elders exchanged glances. The question was an old one. "Perhaps," Vessa said at last. "The world turns in cycles, like the seasons. Cold follows warm, and warm follows cold. But the next time the ice comes, if it comes, it will find us ready." She reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew a small object, a mammoth tooth, yellowed with age, its surface etched with tiny markings. "This was my grandmother's, and hers before her. It reminds us of what was, and what may be again." Aaron took the tooth carefully, running his fingers over the grooves. "How do you know the stories are true?" Jaw laughed, a sound like stones tumbling. "Because the land remembers." He pointed to the north, where the hills rose in gentle swells. "Dig deep enough anywhere, and you'll find the ice's fingerprints. Boulders it dropped, soil it ground to dust. The rivers still follow the paths it carved. The lakes are its footprints. Later, when the fire had burned to embers and the elders had retired to their beds, Aaron crept outside. The moon hung heavy over the fields, silvering the stalks of barley. Somewhere in the distance, a fox yipped. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth, as if he could feel the memories sleeping beneath it, the great cold, the mammoths, the caves where his ancestors had sheltered, all gone but not lost. The wind stirred his hair, carrying with it the faintest whisper of snow, though it was midsummer. Aaron smiled. He would not forget. The ice cores did not lie. Dr. Elara Voss stared at the data scrolling across her screen, the numbers a stark indictment of the present. The graph showed CO2 concentrations over the past 800,000 years, peaks and valleys corresponding with interglacials and ice ages, a rhythmic pulse of the planet's climate. But at the far right of the graph, the line didn't just rise, it spiked, soaring far beyond anything in the geological record. 400 parts per million, 450, and climbing. These levels, Henrik trailed off, his voice tight, are unprecedented, Elara finished. The lab was silent save for the hum of the spectrometer. Outside, snow fell in soft, indifferent flakes, dusting the research station's roof. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here they were, drilling into ancient ice to study past climates, while outside, the world warmed at a rate that would have been unimaginable to the humans who had survived the last glacial maximum. She zoomed in on the most recent section of the core, where the ice was thin and brittle, already showing signs of melt. The layers here were compressed, years blurring together as if time itself were accelerating. The current interglacial, the Holocene, has been remarkably stable, she said. 12,000 years of temperate climate, agriculture, civilizations, all of it made possible by that stability. Henrik exhaled sharply. And now, Elara tapped the screen, where the spike in greenhouse gases dwarfed the natural cycles. Now we've left the Holocene behind. This isn't just another warm period, it's a rupture. The implications were written in the ice. Past interglacials had followed a predictable pattern, a slow climb out of glacial cold, a peak of warmth, then a gradual descent back into ice. The Milankovitch cycles set the tempo, but greenhouse gases acted as the amplifier, smoothing the transitions. This time was different. Human industry had pumped so much CO2 into the atmosphere that the natural rhythm was drowned out. The planet hadn't just warmed, it had lurched. Ice sheets that had taken millennia to form were crumbling in decades. Permafrost that had been frozen since the Pleistocene was thawing, releasing methane in fitful bursts, and the oceans, those vast heat sinks, were turning acidic, their currents faltering. Elara thought of the Neanderthals, the mammoths, the countless species that had been shaped by the Ice Age's slow cadence. They had adapted to changes that unfolded over generations. What hope did modern ecosystems have when the changes were compressed into years? A knock at the lab door broke her reverie. Lynn, the station's youngest researcher, stood holding a tablet, her face pale. "You need to see this." The screen showed satellite imagery of the Greenland ice sheet. Rivers of meltwater snaked across its surface, pooling in cerulean lakes that shimmered under the Arctic sun. "These weren't here last week," Lynn said. "The melt is accelerating." Elara's stomach tightened. Greenland's ice was a relic of the last glacial period, a holdover that shouldn't have survived the Holocene. Its collapse would raise sea levels by meters, drowning coasts, displacing millions, but that wasn't the worst of it. Freshwater pouring into the North Atlantic could stall the thermohaline circulation, the same scenario that had triggered the Younger Dryas cold snap 12,000 years ago. A paradox. Human-driven warming might plunge Europe into a mini ice age even as the rest of the planet baked. History didn't repeat, but it rhymed. That night, Alara dreamt of glaciers. She stood on a barren plain, the wind howling around her, watching as a wall of ice advanced, slow, inexorable, grinding mountains to dust beneath its weight. But when she looked closer, she saw the ice was studded with fragments of the modern world, skyscrapers, cars, the twisted remains of oil rigs. The glacier wasn't just coming. It was remembering. She woke with a start, her breath fogging in the frigid air of her quarters. Outside, the auroras danced, their light reflecting off the snow in shades of green and violet. The past was not dead. It was not even past. And the ice, patient as ever, was keeping score. The storm raged outside the research station, wind screaming like a living thing against the reinforced walls. Inside, the team huddled around the central table, their faces illuminated by the glow of satellite images and climate models. Dr. Henrik Janssen traced a line on the map with his finger, a jagged red arc marking the accelerating retreat of Arctic sea ice. "We're not just looking at a warmer future," he said. "We're looking at feedback loops." Alara nodded, pulling up another dataset. Thawing permafrost releasing methane, darker ocean surfaces absorbing more heat, ice sheets collapsing and altering ocean currents. Each process fueled the next, a cascade of consequences spiraling beyond human control. Lynn leaned forward, her voice barely audible over the storm. "So what happens when the system tips?" The room fell silent. Alara exhaled slowly. The last time CO2 levels were this high, there were palm trees in Antarctica. Sea levels were 20 meters higher. But that took millennia, Henrik countered. Exactly. We're doing in centuries what geology once did over epochs. Life can't adapt that fast. The data painted a grim portrait. The great ice sheets, Greenland, Antarctica, were hemorrhaging meltwater, their ancient glaciers calving into the sea at unprecedented rates. Coastal cities, home to hundreds of millions, faced inundation. The oceans, growing warmer and more acidic, were choking coral reefs and disrupting fisheries, and the jet stream, destabilized by a warming Arctic, was unleashing erratic weather, swinging from droughts to deluges, with merciless unpredictability. Yet the most unsettling revelation lay buried in the ice cores. Alara pointed to a section of the core where the layers grew chaotic. "See this? Dansgaard-Oshka events, abrupt climate shifts during the last ice age. Temperatures in Greenland spiked 10 degrees Celsius in decades." Henrik's brow furrowed. "You think that could happen again?" "Not the same mechanism. But the lesson is clear. Earth's climate doesn't always change gradually. It can flicker like a switch." Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury. The storm was worsening, a reminder of the atmosphere's newfound volatility. Lynn pulled up a live feed from a drone over the nearby glacier, cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, veins of meltwater carving deeper every hour. "It's not just melting," she murmured. "It's shattering." Alara thought of the mammoths, the Neanderthals species that had weathered Ice Age extremes, only to falter when the world changed too fast. Homo sapiens were clever, adaptable, but civilization had been built on the stable climate of the Holocene. Could it survive the coming turbulence? Henrik rubbed his temples. "So what do we do?" Alara closed the datasets, the screens fading to black. "We learn from the past. The Ice Age taught us that climate is fragile, that small nudges can have vast consequences. We're not just passengers on this planet. We're pilots now." She turned to the window, where snow and darkness warred beyond the glass. "And we're running out of time to steer." Later, alone in her quarters, Alara opened a private file, a letter to her unborn niece. She typed slowly, choosing each word with care. "The ice remembers. It remembers the great glaciations, the extinctions, the slow dance of warming and cooling that shaped our world. Now it will remember us, what we did or failed to do in this fleeting moment when we held the future in our hands. She saved the file, then shut her laptop. Outside, the storm raged on. But beneath the ice, the past whispered warnings, and the future waited, frozen in the balance. Time was the first glacier. It moved in slow, inexorable rhythms, carving the world into shapes both beautiful and terrible. The Ice Age had been but a single verse in its endless song, a cold breath held between moments of warmth, a pause in the planet's restless turning. Now, as the last echoes of that age faded into memory, the wind still carried its whispers. High in the Alps, where the last remnants of ice clung to the peaks, a scientist named Elias knelt in the thin mountain air. Before him lay a patch of snow, pristine and white, untouched by the warming world below. He pressed his palm against it, feeling the bite of cold through his glove. "This is it," he murmured to his companion, Mara, "the last of the old ice." She crouched beside him, her breath fogging in the stillness. "How long before it's gone?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The data was clear. Another decade, maybe two, and even these final refuges would vanish. The glaciers that had shaped continents, that had witnessed the rise and fall of mammoths and Neanderthals, would retreat into legend. But the cold was not truly gone. It was waiting. In the Siberian permafrost, a seed stirred. It had lain dormant for 30,000 years, frozen in the belly of an Ice Age squirrel's burrow. Now, as the thaw reached it, water seeped into its ancient husk, awakening cells that had last stirred when woolly mammoths still walked the earth. A scientist, Anya, held the seed in her palm, marveling at its resilience. "Silene stenophila," she whispered, "the oldest life ever revived." In the lab's sterile light she planted it, pressing the seed into damp soil. Days passed. Then, impossibly, a green shoot pushed through the earth, a ghost from a vanished world, reaching for the sun. Life, it seemed, refused to surrender. The planet had known many winters. It had seen snows that buried mountains, ice sheets that spanned continents, cold so deep it scoured the land to bedrock. It had watched as species rose and fell, as forests gave way to tundra and tundra to forests again. And it would know winter once more. The Milankovitch cycles still turned, their celestial clockwork unperturbed by human hands. In 50,000 years, perhaps 100,000, the Earth's orbit would tilt again, its face turning from the sun. The glaciers would regrow, creeping southward, swallowing cities and fields and forests. The ice would return as it always had. But this time, it would find a world altered, not by nature, but by man. On the shore of a Greenland fjord, where icebergs carved into the sea with thunderous groans, a young girl picked up a stone. It was smooth and dark, polished by ice long melted. She turned it in her hands, then skipped it across the water, watching as it vanished into the waves. Her grandfather, his face lined with years of Arctic winds, smiled. "You know, when I was your age, the ice reached all the way to that point." He pointed to a distant ridge, now bare and green. The girl frowned. "Will it come back?" The old man looked north, toward the shrinking ice sheet, then down at his granddaughter. "Yes," he said, "but not in our time." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon, where the sea and sky blurred together. Somewhere beyond that line, the future waited, a tapestry of frost and fire, of endings and beginnings. The wind sighed over the water, carrying with it the memory of cold, and the world, ever turning, held its breath. The end.